Please welcome Dr. Juliet Mian.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think I'm possibly more interested in the beautiful roads than the sustainable and resilient transport, but delighted to be here. I think one of the things I really enjoy about working in sustainable and resilient infrastructure in general is there's so many diverse disciplines that sort of contribute to it, but my career progression and my route to resilience has actually come through working on highways, working on geotechnical assets for highways. So I'm really pleased to be here talking to a lot of like-minded people. So 15 minutes to deal with sustainable and resilient transport. I haven't got all the answers. I hope everyone's not here for that. But having been out in the hall and listening to some of the other talks during the day, what I'm really confident of is that the answers are here. And the question really for all of us is how we scale this up, make this kind of thing a business as usual. Just to sort of set out the context at the beginning, and I'm not on my own certainly today in saying this, that we're not really talking about highways, we're talking about the role of transport, which is the movement of people, goods and services. I was just thinking in the earlier session it would be very interesting to map the sort of movement of how we used to talk about highways and how much more the word mobility is here today. You could do an analysis of that over the last 10 years, and we're all very much focused on mobility and the function of our transport rather than what the actual assets are. So coming back to why this is important, why we need sustainable and resilient highways as part of our transport system, the diagram here is just showing how the role of all critical infrastructure, is that me feeding back? The role of critical infrastructure in supporting everything that we need for a functioning, prosperous society. So that's not just transport, it's transport, water, communications, energy, waste, really underpins everything that we need. And just to look at that, for example, in terms of the global supply of food, if you look at all the elements in the process of food production, food manufacture, food distribution, and how it actually reaches the end consumer, and we sort of say that we're only 6 meals away from anarchy. So a failure in the transport system anywhere through there is really going to impact on wider society. So the challenge we have is, yes, it needs to be reliable. That's really important. It needs to be safe, efficient. You know, that none of those needs have gone away. But what we're more and more aware of now is that our road systems need to be sustainable. We need to be meeting the needs of future generations. We need to be not compromising our already compromised planets. And they need to be resilient. They need to continue to function both for the risks and hazards that we're already aware of, but also for the things that we might not be expecting yet, the knowns and the unknowns. So to take a sort of step back and think about the biggest picture challenges that we're facing, and the first one I think is the growing population. So looked at the statistics this morning, there are 2 billion more people on the planet than there were when I first started working as a civil engineer, but we've still only got one planet. So we've got this fundamental problem of growing population with a finite set of resources. The other very real challenge we're facing is the changing climate. It's not as stable and comfortable as we've been used to for several millennia, and we have to deal with that. So again, the big picture challenges for transportation in general, globalization. None of these are new, but they're all sort of increasing, I think, in terms of rate and significance. We're increasingly connected globally as a world, so failures in transportation systems in one part of the world can very quickly cascade through to things that we rely on here in the UK. Urbanization, with more and more people living in urban areas, and that's projected to continue, means that society really needs the critical infrastructure to be there for it. You know, if you live in a city, you really need the infrastructure underpinning what you can do. I've talked already about population growth and climate change, not just climate change, but the other planetary boundaries. You know, we need to live within the confines of the planet. More particularly from a highways point of view, some of the drivers have changed that are sort of governing our decisions and what we do. A very real, very sort of urgent issue of air quality. the increasing importance of delivering carbon neutral infrastructure and transports, and thinking about changing land use patterns and what that might mean for the transportation of the future. I suspect I'm not the only person, well, actually I haven't seen it this afternoon. I'm sure I won't be the only person during these 2 days to put up the picture of the United Nations SDGs, the 17 goals which are underpinned by 169 targets. I think the fact that they are becoming so familiar to everyone is kind of why they're helpful. We're all talking about these things in the same framework and recognizing this big picture. I also suspect that ARUP is not the only organisation to try and really unpack these in terms of, well, what does this mean for what we do? How can we make sense of the grand vision of the 17 SDGs and make it relevant to the work we do? So this diagram works very well for me. It kind of shows that it's always a balancing act. It's really important to have the right outcomes for the planet and for the environment, but we're balancing that with the outcomes for society. What I like about this figure is the area that we're working in, the built environment, comes right at the middle. It's fundamentally important to both society and planet. So to try and unpack that a bit more, we're looking at roads because they're important for economic prosperity. We've already said for prosperous functioning societies, we need roads, mobility, transportation to do what it can do. The SDG 9 that sits in the middle is all about infrastructure. That's where the requirement for sustainable and resilient infrastructure sits, and the need for innovation to deliver clean technologies and low energy solutions. But we also need roads to be able to deal with climate change. So that's under the SDG 13 for climate action. And we need to be using our resources responsibly, looking after ecosystems, looking after biodiversity, and also thinking about the well-being. So again, coming back to the outcomes for society, and that's where I was mentioning before, air quality, and also reducing road accidents and increasing the safety of roads. And all of that really is to support society. We need the roads to be, some of the words that come under the goals are safe, inclusive, accessible, sustainable, resilient. The title of my talk today is about sustainable and resilient transport. You'll be relieved to know I'm not going to go into debates on the terminology of what sustainable means and what resilience means, because I do see that quite a lot when we're talking about these two areas. But I think the important thing illustrated by this is the two are inherently entwined. I think I've sort of arrived at this topic through thinking about risk and resilience, but the right solutions are those that are both resilient to climate and to other hazards, but are also sustainable. And that's our kind of premise for the solutions. So to think about some of the big challenges that are facing the road industry, the road sector, and I think the sort of point about these is that they're challenges, but they're opportunities. So starting with the digital transformation, the increased use of technology and digital solutions in transport, but really in every aspect of how we live and work, that change is happening. So that's our opportunity to make sure we're introducing sustainable and resilient solutions within that, and not only thinking about some of the sort of smart and efficient things that digital technology can provide us. And there's always a but, and this diagram I use quite often just to show there's huge potential in smart infrastructure to enhance resilience. It's providing data that we didn't have before. It's enabling us to actually create resilience through real-time decisions that we weren't able to make before. But it's also potentially causing a fragility, and whether that's our increased reliance on electricity and on digital connectivity and what happens when they go. We talk about the amazing speed with it, where we've unlearned how to live without technology, if that makes sense. I always use my children as an example and how they don't have a clue how to do anything without their mobile phone, and we're moving more and more towards that reliance on technology, such that as society we're not necessarily resilient when it's no longer there. So another big transformation that's happening is urban transformation, and some of the issues here are kind of on a different spectrum to technology. There's much more focus on active travel on walkways, cycleways, and including all of that in our growing cities. Climate change, I've already mentioned, it's super important as a real sort of driver of change for transportation, and the issues that this is presenting us are twofold, both the need to move our roads and our transport infrastructure towards a carbon neutral solution and how we actually achieve that, but also while we're doing that, and in the long term, climate change isn't going away, how we make sure that the roads are resilient to a highly uncertain future. But again, I think the driver that's coming from climate change is presenting us with a very real opportunity to introduce some of the great sort of solutions that we're seeing outside this room. Adaptive planning and adaptive capacity. One of the things I really enjoy about the work I do is looking for solutions that exist in one sector that aren't necessarily visible in other sectors. So adaptive planning, I see a lot of in the water sector. I haven't seen so much in the road sector to date, but just as a way of not building in huge, expensive, high capex solutions now for climate change, but looking at what we can do that sort of recognizes the uncertainty, allows us to make decisions at the right point through the life cycle of a project. And finally, looking at resilient systems, coming back to the function, not the individual asset. This bridge, which some of you may be very familiar with, was one that failed in Woking during the floods in Cumbria. So the bridge or the asset itself wasn't resilient and it failed, and that created huge problems. But even more so was the role of that bridge within the system of Woking, and the fact that the people who lived on one side of the bridge could no longer, they had to take something like a 40-minute round trip to get to the schools, to get to where they worked, to get to the train station. So it had much wider impacts than simply the loss of the physical infrastructure or even of the utility cables that were within the bridge. So my background's a geotechnical engineer, so I've snuck one small example of geotechnical challenges in here. This is something that's becoming very real for Highways England and some of the work that we've been doing for a long time with Highways England. The geotechnical assets and their performance are moving into an area of much more uncertainty. They're reaching the end of their design life, and they're being asked to survive in a climate that's not what they were designed for. So coming back to the example of adaptive capacity, there's some really useful stuff that can be done here in terms of what do we do? We've got the assets are here, we're dealing with existing assets, and we need to find a way of managing the future uncertainty. So I just wanted to take a very quick opportunity to mention an initiative called the Resilience Shift that Arup's heavily involved in, and I have the role of technical director for the Resilience Shift. Our ambition is really, when I'm talking about scaling it up, it's working with those responsible for planning, financing, designing, operating critical infrastructure systems, so across the whole value chain, equipping practitioners with knowledge and tools to increase the resilience of our critical infrastructure. Oh, I've lost some of my pictures, but that's fine. So the work that we do at the Resilience Shift comes into three areas. The first one is recognizing that influencing policy, whilst that's quite a slow-moving area, is really important to create the enabling environment, the incentives that are needed for increased resilience of our infrastructure systems. The second area, and the one where the majority of our work happens, is about shaping practice. So providing practitioners with tools, approaches, knowledge and information that are going to help them, I guess, do their jobs differently on a Monday morning when this starts to become business as usual. An example of something that we've done in practice is working with TRL to develop a resilience primer for the road sector. So we've got on the Arup stand, and I think on the local authority stand, there's hard copies of that. They're also available on the Resilience Shift website. It's just an example of providing best practice guidance in a way that actually means something and is useful for practitioners. And some of the learnings we've come out from there are areas of action that are needed to upscale resilience. So where we've seen best practice, but we don't see it as usual practice, we've highlighted some of those areas. And the final area, there would be the word learning under there, not just sharing, also sharing. So once we've developed the best practice, one of the really important components is sharing that learning more widely, looking for common understanding across sectors. And I mentioned before about transferring good practice that we see in one sector across to another. There's a great example of this one, which I think is relevant for standing in a room talking to people at a highways conference. So Cape Town approached its day zero last year, which was the day when the city of Cape Town, 4.5 million people, were facing the reality of turning the taps off. The water levels were so low. But what really emerged from that and the learning that we're sharing, which is really important, is that was not just a challenge for the water engineers in the city of Cape Town. Once society, and that included the transport operators, businesses, education, society, once they realized what they were facing, they all understood in a very real way their role within the bigger system and how it's not one system, it's the fact that all our infrastructure systems are highly interdependent. So I think real life examples like Cape Town provide a really good learning point. So just to close really, and as I said, I haven't got all the answers, but I think between us we have, and the real challenge is how we upscale all the great examples that we're seeing in this room around sustainable solutions, around resilience, using digital technology to the best way we possibly can, to develop sort of road solutions that are focused on people, balancing the needs of people with the needs of the planet, to deliver an overall system that is both sustainable and resilient. And that's me done, I think. Thank you.
Okay.